When we think of cities with notorious ties to organized crime, we tend to focus on the streets of New York, London, Mexico City, or perhaps Naples. One city that might not spring to mind straight away is the Canadian city of Montreal. Known primarily for its beautiful architecture, thriving culture, and diverse food scene. Montreal too, however, holds its dark secrets, and few are larger or more intense than the life and times of Vito Rizzuto, an infamous mobster who was alleged to be the leader of Canada's branch of the Sicilian Mafia. Rizzuto was an imposing and powerful gangster who, throughout his time in organized crime, became associated with violent and financial crime, putting his rivals in the ground and risking run-ins with the law. Known casually as Montreal's Teflon Don, a nod to New York gangster John Gotti's title of the Teflon Don, Rizzuto was born into a life of crime and rose through the ranks to become one of the most vicious and conniving mobsters Canada had ever seen. In today's video, we will be bringing you the story of Vito Rizzuto's life from start to finish, examining his early years in Sicily, to his enlisting with the mob and his eventual demise. How did his life and career play out? Why did he turn to a life of organized crime? What made him so formidable? Join us as we answer all of these questions and more, as we meet Canada's most untouchable mobster. On the 21st of February, 1946, Vito Rizzuto was born in the commune of Cattolica Eraclea in Sicily's Agrigento province. At the time, Sicily was a tumultuous place to live, especially for a child. The recent end of World War II had brought about many changes for Italy. An end to the fascist dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, a widespread epidemic of poverty following the struggles of the war, and the persistence of inequality, despite the shift in government. Amidst all of this, the 1940s saw the resurgence of the Mafia in Sicily, who were able to come back stronger than ever, given the poor economic and social state of the island. They quickly consolidated their power across much of the region, and were soon dominating illegal racketeering, gambling, smuggling, and extortion schemes far and wide. There was little doubt about Rizzuto's future from the day he was born. His mother and father both had ties to the Mafia, and it seemed like a logical step for young Vito to follow suit. His mother, Libattina Mano, was the daughter of Antonio Mano, a well-known Mafia leader in Cattolica Eraclea, while his father, Niccolo Rizzuto, would be the founder of the Rizzuto crime family. As the struggles in the Rizzuto family's hometown persisted, they decided to make a change and resettle overseas. Niccolo Rizzuto set his sights on Canada, where he saw a future in the organized crime scene of Montreal, Quebec. When Vito was 8, they packed their bags and took off across the Atlantic to begin this new phase of their lives. There are few records available from Vito Rizzuto's childhood in Montreal, but, by all accounts, he did not enter the Mafia until he was well into adulthood. Still, his life was constantly met with the background noise of his father's Mafia career, his mother's Mafia ancestry, and soon enough, his own wife, who had mob ties of her own. On the 26th of November 1966, Rizzuto married Giovanna Camilleri, the daughter of Leonardo Camilleri, a Sicilian mobster who had also immigrated to Canada following the war. The couple had 3 children, Niccolo Jr., Leonardo, and Libattina, named after their grandparents. Leonardo is believed to have followed closely in his father's footsteps and is reportedly a key figure in the Canadian Mafia to this day. Dates for exactly when Vito Rizzuto formally started working for the mob are hard to come by, but he seems to have risen to power in the 1970s. His appearance amongst the ranks of the Mafia seems to have begun in the Cotroni crime family, who at the time were embroiled in a terrible civil war. Upon moving to Montreal from Sicily, Vito's father had been working for the Sicilian faction of the predominantly Calabrian Cotroni crime family. Relations between the Calabrian and Sicilian halves of the family were rarely positive, and across the 60s and 70s, tension continued to surmount to a boiling point. Rivalries and disputes between the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta and the Sicilian Cosa Nostra were commonplace, but this was a particularly nasty case of mob conflict. In 1973, a violent mafia war began, which tore the Cotroni crime family apart, resulting in the deaths of key members such as Paolo Violi, who was shot in 1978. The war would continue until the early 1980s, by which time the Sicilian faction had managed to wrestle control over the family. What emerged from its ashes in the mid-1980s was the Rizzuto crime family, of which Vito was a prominent member. His foray into the world of organized crime had well and truly begun to take off. It didn't take long for Vito Rizzuto to establish a massive network of criminal dealings, and hundreds of millions of dollars were soon flowing into the Rizzuto crime family as a result of his illegal actions. Law enforcement officials have historically reported that Rizzuto was in charge of a colossal criminal empire that primarily focused on the smuggling and selling of drugs into Montreal, including, but not limited to, hashish, cocaine, and heroin. This alone brought in unimaginable quantities of money into the Rizzuto crime family's hands. But Vito didn't stop here. Across the city, he established many successful loan sharking programs, from which he would launder several $100 million. He took control of the illegal gambling rackets across Montreal, which further supplemented his already massive net worth, and, by the 1980s, had begun to test his luck with more violent crimes too. Reports from this time implicate Rizzuto in a series of contract killings, from which he would have received enormous quantities of money. Rizzuto was also famous for his efforts to unite the warring gangs of Montreal. He brought numerous street gangs under his control, encouraging the criminals of the city to work together rather than against one another. He was seen as more than just a crime boss. He was a natural-born leader who could turn the disarray he saw amongst the streets surrounding him into order. Under his domain, the Mafia flourished in Montreal, and the Rizzuto crime family were quickly rising through the ranks to become the largest and most powerful organization in the city. The contract killings committed in the 1980s do not seem to be Rizzuto's first foray into the world of violence, however. In 1972, he is known to have been issued a 2-year prison sentence for conspiring to commit arson in 1968. His target would have been Renda's hair salon in the Montreal suburb of Boucherville. Rizzuto had planned to set fire to the establishment with the intention of defrauding insurers, so both he and the store owner would profit. He served 18 months of this sentence and was released back into the newly mob war-torn streets of Montreal. This wasn't Rizzuto's only brush with the law in his early years as a gangster, however, and he would find himself in hot water once more in the 1980s. In 1987, one of his drug smuggling boats, carrying 16 tons of hashish, was apprehended by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as it traveled along the coast to the northeast of Newfoundland and Labrador. Along with Rizzuto and 4 of his associates, the police arrested Reynald Desjardins, a junior-ranking mobster for the Rizzuto family at the time, but a man who is now infamous for his role in Canada's organized crime scene. Rizzuto was bailed in the March of 1988 for his role in this massive drug trafficking case, and was put on trial in the October of 1990 in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Much to his delight, the court case was dropped before it even had the chance to properly begin. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were found to have overstepped the bounds of Rizzuto's arrest warrant by wiretapping his meetings with his lawyer at a local restaurant. The arrest didn't deter Rizzuto from returning to his enormous drug trafficking scheme, however, and he would be arrested once more just a few weeks later. This time, it was looking like the charges of conspiracy to import hashish into Canada would stick. Drug dealer Normand Dupuis, Rizzuto's contact on land for distributing and selling his stock, had also been arrested and was willing to testify against the mobster in exchange for a lighter sentence. Just as the trial was about to commence, however, Dupuis reached out to Rizzuto's lawyer and offered not to testify in exchange for $1 million. Rizzuto's lawyer had a trick up his sleeve, though. He had recorded the conversation and managed to get Dupuis charged with obstruction of justice which made him unfit to testify as a witness. As such, the charges were once again dropped, and Rizzuto was free to go. Rizzuto almost met a premature end to his Mafia career once more in the early 1990s, when another one of his lawyers, Joseph Lagana, was convicted in a Royal Canadian Mounted Police sting operation, Project Compote, which implicated him in the laundering of $47 million. Rizzuto himself had been identified as a co-conspirator to Lagana, and the police moved to gather evidence for a possible arrest. However, not enough evidence could be found pinning the laundering of the money directly onto Rizzuto. Somehow, he had evaded the law once again. The Teflon Don moniker was beginning to find its roots. While Canadian authorities declared Rizzuto to be the most powerful mobster in the country at this stage in his career, the FBI only considered him to be a soldier. While he was now a high-ranking gangster in the Rizzuto crime family, the Bureau considered this a division of the infamous New York Bonanno crime family. In reality, he had many connections, and while many of these came from the Bonannos, he continued to maintain ties with mobsters back in Sicily too. Amongst his closest allies were the Contrera Caruana Mafia clan, members of the Cosa Nostra based in Rizzuto's homeland. The clan was composed of massive, big-time drug dealers who found leadership in Alfonso Caruana. Rizzuto may have been able to make such a name for himself, trafficking drugs into Canada as a result of their help. Rizzuto continued to expand on his massive empire throughout the course of the 90s and into the turning of the millennium. By 2000, he was an exceedingly wealthy man, but the law was gradually beginning to catch up with him. Could he manage to stay one step ahead? While Rizzuto had spent a great deal of his criminal career to date successfully evading the grasp of the law, he was not an immortal man. This was proven when his world came under threat in 2004, when a federal grand jury based in Brooklyn indicted him on conspiracy to commit racketeering, loan sharking, and murder. The murder charges in particular were linked to Rizzuto's alleged role in the May 1981 killings of rival Bonanno crime family capo regimes, Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato. Authorities believed that Rizzuto had been one of 4 men who had been employed to kill these capos, under the command of Bonanno crime family boss Joe Massino. They were on the money. Rizzuto had been involved with the killings. Massino had hired him, along with several other hitmen, to put a stop to what he believed was going to be a major power grab, overthrowing him as the leader of the Bonanno crime family. The trial for these crimes took Rizzuto to the United States of America. He was initially arrested in Montreal on the 20th of January 2004, but after an exhausting 31-month-long legal battle, he was extradited to New York on the 17th of August 2006. Now, he would stand before a United States magistrate of the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn. While he was locked up and awaiting trial in Canada, an arrest warrant was issued for Rizzuto from authorities in Rome, Italy too. It seemed that while he was making his millions in Canada, he also had ties to his home country and had been attempting to launder money with the Mafia through the construction of a multi-billion-dollar bridge, the Strait of Messina Bridge, which was intended to connect Sicily with the Italian mainland. The construction of the bridge never went ahead, and while the warrant was issued, Rizzuto did not receive any penalty or prison time for his involvement in this crime. By the time Rizzuto stood trial in New York City, Massino himself had become an informant for authorities in New York and was expected to testify against Rizzuto when he stood trial himself. Fortunately for Rizzuto, this would never happen. A plea bargain was offered to him, in which he would receive a reduced prison sentence if he admitted to the murders. In May of 2007, Rizzuto pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, in addition to the racketeering charges that were brought onto him. He had noted that he was present while the 3 capos were killed, but noted that he had only shouted, "It's a holdup," at the victims, while other hitmen shot them to death. This contradicted the testimonies of the other gangsters who were put on trial for the murders. Salvatore Vitale, for example, who also faced imprisonment for his role in the crime, noted that Rizzuto was the first mobster to reveal himself from his hiding spot during the ambush and spearheaded the shooting. For his role in the 3 capos' murders, Rizzuto received a 10-year prison sentence, followed by a 3-year supervised release, as per the conditions of his plea bargain. He was also ordered to pay a $250,000 fine, a drop in the ocean in comparison to the massive wealth he had built for himself smuggling drugs into Canada. Despite the fact that Rizzuto went to prison for the best part of a decade, the acceptance of this deal was seen as a huge win for organized crime. Organized crime expert Lee Lamothe, for instance, framed the deal as the system having been beaten by the mob. Technically, for crimes as great as Rizzuto's, he should have been facing the rest of his natural life in prison. Getting away with as few as 10 years was tantamount to getting off scot-free. Rizzuto would serve just half of his 10-year sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution, Florence, a medium-security prison in Colorado. Despite the prison's history of harboring violent inmates, and with several notorious murders that have been carried out behind the institution's walls, Rizzuto seems to have had a mostly event-free term inside. The world would not hear from him again until the 5th of October 2012, ready to, by all accounts, return to a life of organized crime. Rizzuto was immediately deported back to Canada upon his release from prison in the United States of America, but instead of heading to Montreal, he decided to lay low for a while in Toronto. He met with representatives of the New York Mafia who were living in Toronto at the time and intended to reinstate his place in the mob, but something was amiss. While he was locked up, his father, Niccolo Rizzuto, had been murdered. On the 10th of November 2010, he had been killed by a single sniper's bullet, which smashed through the doors to his patio and put an end to his life at the age of 86. The assassin was believed to have been Salvatore Calauti, an 'Ndrangheta hitman based in Toronto. He too would be shot dead in July of 2013. It wasn't just Vito's father that had died while he was incarcerated either. Federico Del Peschio, one of his closest associates, was killed in the northern Quebec district of Ahuntsic in the August of 2009 as he passed behind a local restaurant. Later that year, he lost Niccolo Rizzuto Jr., his eldest son, who was shot by a rival gangster in Montreal. In 2010, his brother-in-law and trusted consigliere, Paolo Renda, disappeared in Montreal and is still missing to this day. His father was the last to go in what seemed to be a series of calculated attacks on the crime family he had spent several years building from the ground up. As you can imagine, this took a massive toll on Rizzuto. Vito Rizzuto was now a paranoid man who felt he was living on borrowed time. Throughout his career, he had made many enemies, and now those enemies had sought to take down his father, who had fought alongside him in the Mafia wars of the 1970s. Would the 'Ndrangheta come for him next? Rizzuto wasn't taking any chances now. He moved back to Montreal, reportedly keeping an armored vehicle outside in case of emergencies, and keeping the premises guarded by his allies. He became very conflicted at this stage. It's reasonable to believe that he was probably very scared of an impending assassination attempt, but he wanted any of his adversaries to know that he would not be an easy man to take down. Surrounding himself with as much firepower as he could was his way of sending a message to those who may make an attempt on his life. What followed was a second and final mob war that would prove to be potentially even bloodier than the first. Vito Rizzuto knew at this point in his career that he could not remain in a position of power for much longer. While he remained temporarily safe at his makeshift fortress in Montreal, his power was waning, and his men seemed to be dropping like flies as the 'Ndrangheta made hit after hit. Rizzuto's response was to summon his remaining power in an attempt to make as many revenge hits as he possibly could against the men who had robbed him of his allies and family members. One by one, his men were sent out to claim the lives of individuals he marked for death. A trio of rival drug dealers who had been involved in the kidnapping of an ally of the Rizzuto family in 2008 were first. Emilio Cordileone, Tony Gensale, and Mohamed Awada were shot to death in quick succession, sending a powerful message to the 'Ndrangheta that Rizzuto would not go down without a fight. Rizzuto followed this up by arranging the murder of Joe Di Maulo in November of 2012. DiMaolo was formerly a very influential gangster, allied to the Calabrian faction of the Cotroni crime family, and would meet his end in the driveway of his own home, as Rizzuto's gangsters ambushed him and riddled him with bullets. Interestingly, DiMaolo's funeral was very lightly attended, indicating that he was not as popular or influential as he once was at the time he had been killed. Rizzuto's next target was Giuseppe De Vito, a man who, in 2012, was incarcerated for drug trafficking for the Calabrians. He had been a notorious and difficult to eliminate rival of the Rizzuto crime family, and Rizzuto wanted to start the hit on him by targeting one of his businesses. On the 22nd of December, 2012, one of Rizzuto's gunmen burst into De Vito's Montreal-based coffee shop and killed Dominic Facchini, a rival associate working inside. Rizzuto followed this up in the early days of 2013, when he also had Gaetan Gosselin and Vincenzo Scuderi killed outside of their respective homes for being associates of Giuseppe De Vito. De Vito himself would finally meet his end in July of 2013. While he remained in prison, Rizzuto had managed to lace his food with cyanide, and he met a quick yet grisly end. By the time this second mob war reached its peak, Vito Rizzuto seemed to be ordering the deaths of anybody he saw conveniently. It may have been the paranoia getting to him, or perhaps he had become well and truly unstable by this point. But one man to meet his end on his authority was Juan Ramon Fernandez, an agent that had helped him in Toronto. Fernandez had since moved to Palermo, Italy, in an attempt to remain neutral in Rizzuto's bloody war of revenge, and Rizzuto saw this in itself as an act of defiance and treason. Rather than let Fernandez live out his days away from the fighting, he ordered a hit on his life, and a mobster shot him to death just outside of Palermo in 2013. Rizzuto then ordered the murders of two men he had formerly considered allies, but who had defected to the Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta side of the mob war in recent years: Salvatore Sam Calauti and Moreno Gallo. Gallo was, by all accounts, a close former friend of Rizzuto, but following their falling out, Rizzuto wished to make an example of him. Gallo was killed in Mexico in November 2013 while dining outside of a restaurant in Acapulco, whilst Calauti was shot in the head while he sat in his car in July 2013. Rizzuto reportedly had reason to believe that the latter had been involved with his father's murder. Vito Rizzuto waged this violent mob war against the Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta until his dying day, which was coming sooner than he may have anticipated. While he believed that assassins and hitmen from rival gangs would be imminently kicking down his door to take his life, he failed to account for his own ailing health. He is thought to have been suffering greatly from lung cancer in the early 2000s, and by December of 2013, he had developed pneumonia. He was taken to Montreal's Sacré-Cœur Hospital as a result, and ultimately passed away on the 23rd of December at the age of 67. His official cause of death was reported to have been from these natural causes, but there is some speculation that the 'Ndrangheta may indeed have been responsible, poisoning him in a last-ditch attempt to win the war. An autopsy was never performed on Rizzuto's body, which has been the source of much of this speculation. Rizzuto was laid to rest on the 30th of December 2013 at a funeral service held at the Church of the Madonna della Difesa in the Little Italy neighborhood of Montreal. Over a dozen black limousines with vibrant flower arrangements transported his body to the church. Around 800 people are reported to have attended the funeral service, showing that he was in good standing with a great deal of gangsters and associates at the time he died. His body was then taken to the Saint François d'Assise Cemetery in St. Leonard, a neighboring borough of Montreal. Rizzuto's death struck up a discordant uncertainty for the future of the Montreal Mafia. Throughout his career, law enforcement in Montreal had painted Vito Rizzuto as a supremely powerful, godfather-like figure, while his numerous successful efforts to evade capture by law enforcement earned him the nickname of Montreal's Teflon Don. The police, the public, and the media soon began asking themselves who might be taking Rizzuto's place. Well, the current leader of the Rizzuto crime family is now believed to be none other than Vito's surviving son, Leonardo Rizzuto. Leonardo has been relatively quiet in his leadership of the family following his father's death, but he now faces legal issues of his own. He currently stands accused of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for killings he supposedly carried out with 10 other gangsters between 2011 and 2012. The court case is ongoing, and we'll have to see how it turns out. If Leonardo is found guilty and receives a lengthy prison sentence, this could well mark the end of the Rizzuto crime family, now that legal crackdowns are making it very difficult for them to continue to operate in Montreal. The massive revenge drive on the 'Ndrangheta did not stop with Vito Rizzuto's death either. Mafia-related killings were commonplace across Montreal for the 2 to 3 years that followed, with many of Rizzuto's old allies taking the stand against their Calabrian enemies. Although they have now taken a back seat, the effects of Rizzuto's brutal campaign against his foes has left scars on the city, and he has indeed gone down in history as one of Montreal's most accomplished and formidable gangsters. His legacy has found a place in the media, with Antonio Nicasso and Peter Edwards having published the book Business or Blood, Mafia Boss Vito Rizzuto's Last War in 2015. The book would later be adapted into a television series, Bad Blood, in 2017, in which Anthony LaPaglia would play Rizzuto himself. Vito Rizzuto's career is looked upon from the world of Canadian law enforcement with something that may even begin to resemble reverence. Pierre de Champlain, who used to work as an intelligence analyst for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police during Rizzuto's time in power, is known to have said of him, "During Vito Rizzuto's era, if everything was going well for organized crime in Montreal, it was because of Rizzuto." There is no doubt that he was a highly successful and efficient gangster, even by Mafia standards, having evaded the clutches of law enforcement for most of his life, as well as the potential attempts on his life at the hands of 'Ndrangheta. Pierre de Champlain added, remarking on the end of Rizzuto's life, "The Mafia is in complete disarray. There's definitely no emerging leader. That's why the situation is unstable and volatile. There may never be another gangster in Montreal, or indeed Canada, as influential and reputable as Vito Rizzuto. His son has, if he is indeed the leader of the Rizzuto crime family now, inherited a difficult world, facing increasing crackdowns by law enforcement and the constant threat of clashes with rival gangs. Will he be condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison, or will he too evade capture to become the Teflon Don successor? Only time will tell as the trial continues.